Oh, hello. Thanks so much, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to Recovery Jam. My name is Melissa C. I'm a recovered compulsive overeater. I live in New York and happy to be here tonight. Happy to see all of you. And you know, the topic that I'm going to talk about tonight is about unmanageability. And the title I kind of gave it is "What do you mean my life is unmanageable?" Because um I didn't like that. I didn't like to be told that when I first came in. I was like, I don't think I'm unmanageable. I think I'm managing quite fine. I just need to lose weight. And and so I think it often requires us looking at it to really understand because, you know, here's the thing about this disease. Before we can do last week when we talked about the doctor's opinion. And that is like one kind of avenue that I could use to help people diagnose themselves. And then we start using words like powerlessness and unmanageability, and people, I say people, I mean me. I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. You know, I'm not so sure about that. And the reason that we have to be so sure about that is that the the work the way that I have to live my life, the steps that I have to take, they're pretty drastic proposals. That's what it says. These are drastic proposals. And if I believed that I had power and the ability to manage, I wouldn't be so on board with drastic proposals. So it's important for us to really come to the end of ourselves to know that I'm going to require this, that I am the type with whom all other methods have failed. And unmanageability, when I when we talk about unmanageability, people often go like they go right to the bedevilments. They'll look and they'll say, okay, let me look at the bedevilments. And if you're not sure what the bedevilments are, it's in We Agnostics, and it's on page 52. And here's what the bedevilments are. We were having trouble with personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were a prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. And I think about it like this: the bedevilments to me are the consequences of unmanageability, of not being able to manage this problem, my life, me. I live with the bedevilments. And so they're the evidence of an unmanaged life. And, I think there's also a world of misunderstanding around this word. People often point out the things in their life that are manageable. It's like, wait, wait, wait. There's like this defensive posture we take, and we'll point at what's still working. My job, for example. I never lost my job. I always say, like, I always paid my mortgage. Even through the height of this disease, I never failed to pay my mortgage. My kids were doing okay. I was not really the most pleasant mom to be around, but my kids were okay still. And so I was always pointing out the things that look to be manageable, you know. And I also, here's the thing too, I also think there's a danger in carrying the message if we focus too heavily on the consequences. So, for example, like we always tell our stories and we always tell where this disease kind of took us. And, you know, I, I talk about my craziness, right? I tell a little bit of the stories about myself. I talk about how heavy I go, or the crazy diets that I tried, or, the lengths I went to. And here's the danger: if you're not that bad, meaning if you've never reached that weight, right? You never broke your leg trying to run off a binge, you might say, okay, I'm not that. I'm not as bad as she is. This problem that I have isn't so serious, right? Or if your horror story is worse than mine, you might also say, yeah, no, this won't work because I'm so much worse. So I think we have to be careful. Although I always want to tell my story, right? I always want to show. I usually show my pictures, and that's one way to draw people in. I also always want to kind of talk about the thinking, that unmanageability in my brain, because that is the common denominator. Whether you've worn this disease, at 300 pounds, or have worn it at far less a weight than that, or maybe even at the other end of the spectrum, the common denominator is our thinking. You know, um, and here's the other thing too. If you're thinking, well, I'll wait until all aspects of my life are down the drain, right? Like I don't have it that bad. Maybe I just have to wait. Maybe I just haven't reached my bottom yet. Here's what I'll tell you. Every line in the sand I drew, I crossed. Every time I said, well, I'll stop when I get to this, I went way past that before stopping. And if you're waiting, for your life to circle the drain, well, this disease is progressive, so it will, right? If you have what I have, it will. And so, if I have an unmanageable problem, I could say it like this. I can just say that it can refer to the fact that I cannot manage the most basic function of all, which is how much to feed this body. Like that to me seems pretty unmanageable, that a human being is unable to feed her body the proper amount of food, right? And yet, you know, I can't manage the amount of food I eat because I have an allergy. Okay. But a lot of people have allergies to foods and they're not unmanageable, right? So an allergy alone does not explain the unmanageability. What really makes me unmanageable is that I cannot seem to manage keeping away from the foods and eating behaviors that I know I'm allergic to. So I can know I have this allergy. I can know that every time I eat it, it triggers a certain response. And yet I cannot stay away from eating that. That to me seems like an unmanageable problem, right? Whether or not I failed to pay my mortgage, whether or not, you know, I lost my job. The fact that I can't feed my body the right amount of food and I know what I need to do is pretty unmanageable. And if you are manageable, right? If you've got something that's manageable, it means that you can rely on certain tools, certain systems, certain practices, some methods to keep things running well. And these methods consistently keep the business or structure operating, right? They're consistent. It's like, okay, this is the method I work. It's going to always work. It's my method. And I think about it like this. Right now, I'm a teacher, right? And I have a student teacher. And a lot of what I'm teaching her, instructing her, is on classroom management, right? And in my experience of 27 plus years of teaching, all students, all classrooms are actually manageable. They are. So long as, right, we have like I say like a toolbox full of things, and we have to figure out which tools are going to work for which population of kids and tweak them and work on them. And really what I'm working on with my student teacher is finding out which ones are going to be effective, right? I know the ones that work, and I'm working on her finding out. So if I'm working with her on that, if the kids run amok, if they're not behaving and nobody's learning anything, I could say, okay, you've got to work on your management strategies. And eventually, if she follows through and she's consistent, she's going to land on the one that's going to work, right? And it will work. It will. it will work most of the time, right? And that once we reach that point, we'll say, okay, the students are manageable. But my experience has shown me that when dealing with my disease of compulsive eating, I can't rely on any of my methods, none of them. In fact, one of the ones that it seemed like it would work really great suddenly will no longer work, right? And so they're just not effective. In the doctor's opinion, it says this: we're of the type with whom all other methods had failed completely. So if no method works consistently, if they fail completely, that's a definition of something that's unmanageable. And our big book does an excellent job highlighting this. And my talk is really about delving into the text to create a list of all the methods that I cannot use to manage my disease. And the object of creating this lengthy list is to snuff out the thought that you can still do this job alone. Because remember, that's the prerequisite. You have to know that I'm going to have to, do some pretty drastic proposals. I'm going to have to go to some pretty drastic measures. So let's take a look at all the methods we tried. You know, and that really the second part of step one is necessary to drive us out of the delusion that we can solve our problems on our own. That's really the second part of step one. That unmanageability factor is like, oh, yeah. I not only have something that I can't control, but I will never be able to control it. Right? It is an unmanageable problem. So I'm like a lover of lists. I always like little numbered lists. I think they're really helpful for me. Um, and in Bill's story, here's the first thing, right? That I can't use. Bill's story on page 5 through 6, it says, shortly afterward, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way, and I had taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder, for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed to be near just that. Renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time passed, and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. I could laugh at the gym mills. Now I had what it takes. And one day I walked into a cafe to telephone, and in no time I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it had happened. And as the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better next time, but I might as well get good and drunk now then. So when I go through this, right, I'm making this list. And if you're like me, you're like a lovely note taker type of person, then maybe you want to create this list along with me. And in that short little paragraph that I read, I've got 4 things that I can't use. Number 1, fighting. Can't use fighting. Number 2, resolve. Number 3, my mind. And number 4, perspective. Can't use perspective. So fighting this disease has looked like, for me, getting really serious about the severity of my problem. And I'm going to gather up my arsenal of diet strategies, and I'm going to come at it from the angle that I can beat this problem. But the fight always results in me losing. And because I could not sustain the energy required to fight for long, I lose my energy to keep up the fight. And resolve, right? The other word here is resolve. And, even that word tells me, I love that word because I like to break it up. It's resolve, resolve. So, meaning I'm going to have to do it again. Well, if I solved it, why do I have to do it again? Right? That makes no sense because it never worked. It never works for long. And the problem I have with making up my mind is that my mind can't stay consistently made up. I make up my mind, and then just like that, my mind gets changed. And it would be just like this. I always would give myself a start date, the date I'm going to start. I would sometimes I'd even write it in the calendar. And then the date would approach. And just like that, I'd change the date. My mind would change and I would say, no, 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 I don't really mean this date. I mean, after Christmas, and no, I'm not going to do it after Christmas. It's got to be after New Year's. And that can't be after New Year's. My husband's birthday is a couple weeks later. It's got to be after that. So it was like consistently, I was always changing my mind. Or I would make up my mind about what specific foods I cannot eat. And then my mom would be changed that, no, 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 I don't think that's really a problem food at all. That seems kind of crazy, right? I would always be making up my mind and then changing my made up mind, and then perspective, right? So a perspective is the way of looking at something. And I don't have perspective when it comes to this disease. I could not fairly assess the seriousness of this problem in the moments when I needed to understand just how critical it is. I could always seem to understand the seriousness of my problem after the fact. But in the midst of the fact, it didn't seem so serious, and I would succumb to the desire. But in the midst of the situation, I could never appreciate the seriousness. Never. It never seemed that serious. It always seemed like I was making too big a deal out of something. In Bill's story again, on page 8, here's another thing we can't use: fear. It says here, trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me up for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink. Okay, so fear does not work. And I have been terrified in the past. I've been afraid of consequences, the physical health consequences. When I received a diagnosis that I had dangerously high blood pressure, my doctor told me, you're not going to make it past your 40s. I was warned, that the enamel on my teeth was wearing down from all my gum chewing. I was warned not to run on a foot that had been injured. I was afraid each and every time I was afraid. But really, the more fearful I was, the more I needed to eat, because the discomfort I feel when I'm afraid, right? Without a sufficient relationship with God, the thing that I desire mostly is to not feel afraid. And the thing that I would always go to was the bite. That's exactly it. So if I now move on to there's a solution, page 22 to 23, it says this: we know that while the alcoholic keeps away from drink, as he may do for months or years, he reacts much like other men. We are equally positive that once he takes any alcohol, whatever, into his system, something happens, both in the bodily and mental sense, which makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. The experience of any alcoholic will abundantly confirm this. So these observations would be academic and pointless if our friend never took the first drink, thereby setting the terrible cycle in motion. Therefore, the main problem of the alcoholic or the compulsive eater centers in his mind rather than in his body. If you asked him why he started on that last binger, the chances are he will offer you any one of 100 alibis. And sometimes these excuses had a certain plausibility, but none of them really make sense in light of the havoc an alcoholic drinking bout creates. They sound like the philosophy of the man who, having a headache, beats himself on the head with a hammer so he can't feel the ache. If you draw this fallacious reasoning to the attention of the alcoholic, he will laugh it off or become irritated and refuse to talk. And once in a while, he may tell the truth. And the truth, strange to say, is usually that he has no more idea why he took that first drink than you have. Some drinkers have excuses with which they're satisfied part of the time, but in their hearts, they really do not know why they do it. And once this malady has real hold, they're a baffled lot. There is the obsession that somehow, someday, they will beat the game, but they often suspect they're down for the count. So if I go back to that list, right? Mind was repeated again, so I don't need to write it. But reasoning, they just mentioned reasoning. I can apply this fallacious reasoning, faulty reasoning. 7, talking, right? Trying to talk to someone about this problem. Let's talk about it. Let's talk it through. Let's talk the binge through. Let's talk about what happened the last time. Let's talk about your reasons why. Talking doesn't work. That's not a manageable strategy. Um, or telling the truth, right? I heard it once, I can't eat, um, I can't eat once I know the truth. No, that's not true for me because I learned the truth 30 years earlier, 30 plus years earlier. Knowing the truth, that's not sufficient power. That's information, but that wasn't enough. And my own experience was that any reason I gave for picking up the food, for me, from my dad dying to it being a birthday celebration, there was no real reason that could explain why I would knowingly cause myself to hurt myself, right? I've had enough knowledge with this disease to know that if I ate because my dad died or I ate because it was my birthday, it was going to lead me to the same painful spot. It always led me to that same spot, never feeling satisfied, always feeling defeated. And so I could try to talk this problem through, maybe a therapist, a friend, or a lecture, and that didn't work. And this idea about the truth, I couldn't even differentiate the true from the false. My alcoholic life really seemed the only normal one. Eating that way only seemed normal. And there's a solution on page 24. It says this: the fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so called willpower becomes practically non existent. So I can't use choice, I can't make good choices, and I can't apply willpower. That's not a way that I'm going to manage this problem. Um, and we are unable at certain times to bring into consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week ago. We're without defense. So I can't use my memory. I can't rely on suffering or humiliation, right? So number 9, choice. 10, willpower. 11, memory. 12, suffering. 13, humiliation. I'm going to tell you right now, if it takes my student teacher 13 different methods to try to get my class under control, they're unmanageable. But this isn't even half of what I've tried, which tells me that I have like beaten this thing into the ground. I have tried every method to control it, every method to manage this problem. When it talks about choices, I have never been able to just make better food choices. And I remember hearing at a meeting once a woman saying that she no longer chooses to hurt herself with food. I've never had a choice whether I was going to hurt myself with food or not. There was no choice. You know, I it was not like I was choosing to hurt myself with the food. Food was my master. Food decided for me. It made the choice and I went along, right? So, as for willpower, I have used every bit of willpower I have had. And at best, it's temporary. It's effective temporarily, but it's completely unreliable. Because what happens with willpower is I never know when it's going to run out. It's just all of a sudden not there. Always when I need it the most, I no longer have it. you know. And as for memory, well, I have a great memory for all sorts of things, but where food is concerned, I think I have a specific type of food senility. I just cannot remember. I have a different functioning mind. The memory of the pain it causes me is not accessible at the times when I need to call upon the memory of that pain. You know, um, I can't remember physical suffering. When it talks about suffering. I mean, I have had terrible suffering from this disease, from everything from horrendous acid reflux, like burning me so that I couldn't sleep, painful. And yet I could not remember that when I went to eat the foods that caused it. Could not remember, you know, I couldn't remember anything in those times. It's my memory. And Janet talks about that broken bridge. That really is, it's true. And I have to say, like, oftentimes when I would be about to binge, it wasn't that I didn't remember that this food was going to cause me to binge. One of the things that I actually would fail to remember was that I cared. It was like the fact that I actually cared about myself, my life, was a memory I couldn't call upon in that moment. I remember thinking, I don't care. I really don't care. And that's not true. I know I really did care. I just couldn't remember really in those moments that I cared. And humiliation, right? This idea about humiliation. I gained 100 pounds in high school. I mean, if humiliation would have worked, there is nothing more humiliating than gaining 100 pounds in your teenage years. It's brutal. And that didn't work, you know. All right. In More About Alcoholism, page 30 says this: we alcoholics are men and women who have lost the ability to control our drinking. We know that no real alcoholic ever recovers control. All of us felt at times that we were regaining control, but such intervals, usually brief, were inevitably followed by still less control, which led in time to pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. We are convinced to a man that alcoholics of our type are in the grip of a progressive illness. Over any considerable period, we get worse, never better. Okay, so here's number 14 on my list: considerable periods, basically times free of the food. That if I could only have this amount of abstinence, I'll be okay. That would be like my management strategy. I'll make sure that I don't eat for this period of time and then it will pass and I will be okay. Well, I have had some considerable periods of time without food. In my early 20s, I first discovered OA. I got a food plan. I always say I got a food plan that I practiced like the religion, and I got an abstinence that was my God. That was the only thing I had. That was it. And I stopped eating sugar because I found out it was a problem and it made perfect sense. And I was young and I was able to put it down without doing much. But a considerable period did not work because years in, I picked up that sugar. I picked up, for me, it was alcohol. It didn't matter. Just like that, I was worse than I was before. And it didn't matter how much time had passed. Considerable periods of time, it's not a management strategy. And that religion, that I practiced, that food plan that I practiced to worship the abstinent God, I could not practice again. I just could not get myself back in. So it didn't matter how long I had been abstinent. It was not a sufficient power. In More About Alcoholism on page 32 to 33, it says this: a man of 30 was doing a great deal of spree drinking. He was very nervous in the morning and he quieted himself with liquor. This tells this whole story here that he was an exceptional man. He found out about this problem, and he remained bone dry for 25 years. And he retired at the age of 55 after a successful and happy business career. And then he fell victim to the belief, which practically every alcoholic has, that his long period of sobriety, right? That's that period without eating, without drinking that we just talked about, and self discipline had qualified him to drink like other men. And then it talks that, he was puzzled and humiliated, and he tried to regulate his drinking for a while, and he could not, right? And then he tried to gather all his forces, and he attempted to stop altogether, and he found he could not. And every means of solving his problem, which money could buy, were at his disposal, and every attempt failed. And he went to pieces quickly. He was dead within 4 years. So here we've got some more strategies. 15, self-discipline. Doesn't work. 16, regulating. 17, force. And 18, money. Money doesn't work, right? Money does not work. Otherwise, we would never see one rich person in the rooms of Overeaters Anonymous or with an addiction of any kind. They would just throw money at the problem and all would be well. All right. Well, I'll tell you what, self-discipline doesn't work either, because I actually have self-discipline in other areas of my life. In my job, I've had self-discipline. For me, academics, I've always been disciplined where my academics were concerned. I can't apply that same discipline where food is. When I went for my master's program, I went back to school. I had a full-time job. I was going to school on the weekends. I had enough self-discipline to not go and do things with friends. I missed events because I was focused on getting my advanced degree. I had self-discipline there. And I could even have self-discipline, although I love to shop and I love to spend money. I can look at my bank account and say, easy does it, sister. And I can apply some self-discipline and not, and leave Amazon alone for a little bit, right? I can do that. I can't do that when food is concerned. I have no self-discipline. It's not something I can utilize. Um, Regulating, what is regulating? Regulating is trying to, like, eat things in healthy portions. That's regulating. I'm going to regulate it. I'm going to have it on Friday only. I'm going to regulate it. I'm going to have just 3 cookies, right? That's trying to regulate it, make it like regular people do. Not so with me, right? Force. Okay, I can't use force because if I'm fighting it, I'm the loser. I can't rely on force. Can't fight this thing. It is so much stronger than I am. And money, holy smokes. I used to have this kind of idea when I was younger. If it costs a lot of money, it's going to work. It was like, if this scheme, I loved schemes. I was like addicted to schemes. If the scheme is crazy sounding and it was expensive, I was all in. Like, made no sense. I threw so much money at this problem. I paid thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. Everything from buying clothes that were like my goal clothes. I'm throwing money at this problem. I'm going to buy this, and that's going to get me to put the food down so I can wear it, right? All right. So next, we're going to talk about knowledge of himself. There's the part of the story where Jim puts whiskey in his milk, and he has this idea that He felt reassured that he was taking whiskey on a full stomach. And that experiment went so well that what did he do? He ordered another whiskey and he poured into it more milk. And that didn't seem to bother me. So I tried another. He had much knowledge about himself as an alcoholic, yet all reasons for not drinking were easily pushed aside in favor of the foolish idea that he could take whiskey if only he mixed it with milk. And then it says this: whatever the precise definition of the word may be, we call this plain insanity. How can such a lack of proportion of the ability to think straight be called anything else? So, okay, number 19, knowledge about yourself. He had knowledge about himself, didn't work. 20, proportion, using proportion. And 21, the ability to think. Well, I know a lot about myself. I've read self-help books, I've gone to therapy, I've dug in deep. I've even studied Overeaters Anonymous, the text. I've even studied this. By the way, studying it and doing it are two different things. Studying it is gaining knowledge. This is not an informational program. Get it. This is a transformational program. Information is not the same as power, right? So I can have really good knowledge about myself. And proportion. Well, am I able to put things in the right proportion, in the right perspective? Do I truly know what's important? If I can look at things and have proportion with it, it means that I know what's most important and I know what's possibly not as important. And I'll tell you this: if I am more concerned about what the host of a party thinks about me, right? So I'm uncomfortable asking the host or hostess what it is they're serving or what was in that food, in the ingredients, or just bring my own stuff if I'm unsure, but I'm uncomfortable that I might offend them or it might look like I've got bad manners somehow. And yet I know that I have an allergy that will kill me. If I am willing to say it's more important to please a host than to protect my own life, that means I have no proportion. I lack proportion of the ability to think straight. And I have fallen prey into that one many a time. And I've met many people in the rooms of Overeaters Anonymous who had same situation. They were in a predicament and they were like, I didn't want to ask what was in it. I would be embarrassed in front of my boss. I'd be uncomfortable in front of my mother-in-law. Well, that's lacking proportion. So that's a management strategy that does not work for us, right? 21, the ability to think. All right, I can't use my ability to think. Remember, the main problem centers in my mind. Therefore, I have a mind that cannot use thinking as a management strategy, right? Um, Page 39, it says, but the actual or potential alcoholic, with hardly an exception, will absolutely be unable to stop drinking on the basis of self knowledge. Okay, self knowledge doesn't work. And, I listed it before, like that knowledge about yourself, but it's kind of worth repeating because this idea of self knowledge has been something that I really thought would help me. And oftentimes, early sponsees, early in the work, will spend a lot of time trying to figure out why they have this, right? There's a lot of talk like, well, and I don't mean this disrespect at all. A lot of us come here this way. I had a lot of trauma. I had a lot of trauma. If I can just sort of discuss my trauma, if I can kind of dig in to what happened to me in my earlier life, Okay, that's all self-knowledge. And I might know all that, but it doesn't seem to be an effective management strategy when it comes to putting the food down. It's information. It might be interesting, but it's not really an effective strategy. Knowing what happened to me, having a lot of knowledge about myself. No. By the way, even having knowledge about the foods that cause problems for me, that in and of itself is not enough. I can have great knowledge about what I shouldn't eat. I've known from the time I was 14 what foods got me into trouble. Had a lot of knowledge about that. Was not sufficient help. Okay, so page 41 to 42, it's going to talk about Fred. And, he went to Washington, he had business, and everything went great, actually. Um, and yet, as soon, he wound up drinking. And it says here that he went carefully over that evening in Washington. He wanted to like delve into it. And he realized not only had I been off guard,
Back on. Is that okay?
I had made no fight. I had made no fight whatever against the first drink. This time I had not thought of the consequences at all. I had commenced to drink as carelessly as though cocktails were ginger ale. I now remembered what my alcoholic friends had told me, how they prophesied that if I had an alcoholic mind, the time and place would come when I would drink again. They had said, though I did raise a defense, it would one day give way before some trivial reason for a drink. And so, 22, staying on guard, 23, consequences, and 24, defense. And here's the problem with staying on guard. Who's the guard, right? I'm the guard. I'm the biggest danger, right? The one, I'd say it like this, it's the guard. It's like putting the wolf in charge of the picnic basket. Like I have no ability to guard myself against this. Um, and again, consequences. If consequences were to have been enough, I'll tell you what, as far as classroom management strategies, consequences are the best form of management. In fact, most behavior is easily managed by consequences. It's all like reward, punishment, right? Reward, punishment. That's a pretty effective strategy. And if you can get, like in the classroom, if you can get the kids to like internalize those consequences themselves, like all the better. Not so in this disease. Like consequences, nope. Otherwise, 5 pounds gained, the consequence of my jeans not buttoning, that would have done something. The consequences of binging when I didn't want to would have done something. Consequences don't work. And defense, defense is being able to resist the attack, being able, to resist. And food for me always won because we're told it's cunning, it's baffling, and it's powerful. It's a cunning, baffling foe. I can't defend myself against it because it doesn't look harmful. It's if I'm the right, we'll get back to that wolf story. Well, my problem is that the disease does not show up looking like a wolf. It shows up looking like Little Red Riding Hood. It doesn't look very harmful. Most of the time when I've fallen into the food years ago, and people that I've worked with, they don't start eating on the cupcake. It's usually something that seems harmless. Sloppy measuring, failing to report a food change, right? Not really being diligent about exactly what was in something, having just a couple of extra bites, those things that seem seemingly harmless are the ways that, we sort of like let the disease get its toe in the door, right? So I can't rely on defense. And then in working with others, it says this: in our belief, any scheme of combating alcoholism which proposes to shield the sick man from temptation is doomed to failure. So it says here we've tried these methods. All right, so combats, number 25, combats, number 26, shields. If I am attempting to combat it, it means that it is controlling me. If anything I am fighting, it means that it has power over me. I have no peace when I'm fighting. And as for a shield, guess what I do? I simply remove the shield. I put a shield up. Here's what a shield would look like for me. I would demand that my family get all those foods out of the house. That's going to be my shield. Don't bring it in the house. You're not allowed to. And then here's what I would do. I would remove the shield and I would start eating the things that I told them they couldn't bring in the house outside of the house. Right? Because that shield wasn't there then. I would start eating it there. And then, um, and then I would just, no longer eat it in secret. I would just be like, forget it. And I would bring it back in the house. And I often think, no wonder why people in my life years ago gave me a hard time when I got abstinent. They didn't understand it. For a long time, my husband would say, like, it just has a little bit of that in it. What do you mean? He didn't understand. People in my family, it took them a while to get it because I was constantly changing the rules on these people. They didn't, and here's a news alert: they don't have to understand. I do, you know. And now, like nearly 11 years in, it's going to be 11 years next week, they don't question it anymore because they've seen the evidence, right? So, I know, right, whenever we talk about unmanageability, we discuss the bedevilments, and I've definitely had some experience with that. And, but I haven't suffered them all yet. I haven't suffered them all yet. But I do believe that those painful consequences await me if I once again decide that I am manageable. And, and I think it's important, alcoholics that still have their health. It says this in the AA 12 and 12. Alcoholics who still have their health, their families, their jobs, even two cars in the garage, began to recognize their alcoholism. How is it? Because we raised the bottom up. How do we raise the bottom up? Well, we don't remove any individual's unique experience of desperation. That's not the way that I'm going to raise the bottom up. I'm not going to prevent anybody from the consequences of this, right? I can't do anything where that's concerned. However, I can talk about the mental state. And hopefully that this idea of unmanageability kind of drilled in on that, you know, I think also what can we do to help someone else is that we can share what we've learned freely and we can live in a way that makes recovery look like the most beautiful gift that it really is. Because it really is. Having this unmanageable problem has been the greatest gift of my life. I'm so grateful that I have that problem that's unmanageable because I have a relationship with a creator that can manage all of it and I no longer need to. And so today I know I am not equipped to manage my disease, and I'm certainly not equipped to manage my life. Nothing, absolutely nothing human could fix me, but God could and has. And so I continue to seek. And with that, I'll pass.
Thanks, Melissa.